Tokyo in the winter holds cold the way stone holds cold, deeply, without drama, from the inside out. The Kokugikan had stood in the Ryogoku district for decades as the spiritual and physical home of Sumo. Not the newer version of the building, the old hall, with its dark timber framework and its curved roof that swept upward at the corners and the particular architectural gesture that said, without language, "This place is different from other places." The roof had weathered several generations of Japanese winters. The walls had absorbed several generations of contests decided by mass and leverage and the ancient, codified tradition of one enormous body moving against another. Outside, in the streets of Ryogoku, the cold was clean and still. The district itself was quieter than central Tokyo, organized around a different rhythm. The rhythm of a neighborhood that has been built around a single discipline for so long that the discipline had become the neighborhood. Chanko restaurants where the broths had been perfected over decades. Training stables where men spent their lives becoming something that most human beings would never need to become. The smell of the river nearby, and the cold, and the particular silence of a winter evening in a place that knew it was important and did not need to announce it. Inside the Kokugikan, 2,000 people had gathered. It was an unusual gathering for the venue, not a regular tournament. Those had their own ceremony, their own architecture of ritual that the initiated understood and the uninitiated found impenetrable. This was different. Private exhibition was the designation, though 2,000 people made the word private approximate rather than literal. Private meant that no ticket had been offered to the general public. Private meant that the people present had been invited, selected, chosen, journalists of certain stature, practitioners of various disciplines, sponsors, officials, figures from the martial arts community of Asia and beyond who had been brought to Tokyo for something that was presented as simply a demonstration, but that everyone who had accepted the invitation understood was rather more than that. The dohyo was prepared at the center of the hall. The circular fighting platform, elevated, covered in clay, the sacred rope boundary marking the ring, had been set with the precision of ceremony. This was always how it was. The dohyo was never unprepared. The dohyo was treated with the reverence that other cultures reserve for altars, because in this tradition, it was one. The roof structure above it, the hanging canopy in the colors of the four seasons, caught the overhead light and gave the platform a quality of being lit from multiple directions simultaneously. The 2,000 in attendance were quiet in the way of people who have been present at significant events before and have learned that the most significant part of any significant event is its beginning, and that the beginning is best met with attention rather than noise. Near the front, the positions of proximity and significance, sat representatives of the Sumo governing body, men of formal bearing, of measured expression, whose faces communicated tradition and gravity simultaneously. They had agreed to this exhibition with the complicated feelings of people asked to introduce something new into a space that had been deliberately kept old. At the east entrance of the dohyo, the Yokozuna prepared. His name was Takanohana, not that Takanohana, an earlier bearer of wrestling names that carried their lineage like titles of nobility. He was the third-rank Yokozuna in the active roster, which meant he was, by any measure available, among the most dominant human beings in a discipline that had been measuring human dominance for 15 centuries. 580 pounds, 6 feet 1 inch, which meant the weight was not distributed vertically but horizontally, densely, massively. The specific geometry of sumo conditioning that produces a body unlike any other athletic body in the world. His legs alone were the circumference of most men's torsos. He completed his shiko, the ceremonial leg raise, the stamp, the ritual that preceded all contests and was simultaneously warm-up and prayer and declaration. His foot met the clay with the sound of a significant thing landing. The 2,000 watched him and were still. At the west entrance, someone was waiting. He had arrived before the ceremony began, had taken his position without announcement, without elaboration. He had been standing there long enough that some of the audience nearest the west entrance had looked at him already and looked away, cataloging him as a functionary of some kind, an assistant, a handler, someone belonging to the support structure of the evening. He was not a functionary. He was what the evening was arranged around. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched the Yokozuna complete his ritual with the calm attention of a man observing something he respects without being reduced by it. His face was composed. His breathing was invisible at this distance. He was 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds. The 2,000 people who had not yet understood what they were looking at looked at him and continued their process of not yet understanding. The moment of recognition traveled through the hall like a current finding its path. It moved from the officials to the journalists to the practitioners to the general body of the audience, and as it moved, it changed quality, the way a message changes quality as it passes through different kinds of attention. The officials recognized him with the formal reserve of their training. The journalists recognized him with the specific alertness of their profession. The practitioners recognized him, some of them, with something more complicated, with the particular expression of people who have heard a name spoken with reverence and are now seeing the physical reality attached to the name and conducting the always difficult reconciliation between reputation and visible fact. The visible fact, against the backdrop of the Kokugikan and the Dohyo and the 580-pound man completing his entrance ritual, the visible fact was small. This was the room's first and most powerful conclusion. The conclusion that 2,000 people reached independently and nearly simultaneously, the conclusion that needed no discussion because it was the product of the eyes alone. Takanohana had finished his preparation. His attendants withdrew. He stood at the edge of the Dohyo and looked across it. He was not a man who expressed surprise easily. The years and the tradition of his discipline had constructed around him a quality of contained composure. The composure of a man who had faced many opponents and had never faced one who caused him genuine concern. He looked at Bruce Lee with the same composure. Then his expression shifted. A fraction. The fraction that a face moves when a man has expected something and received something different. He looked at the officials in the front row. One of them met his eyes and offered nothing back. He looked at Bruce Lee again. He descended the Dohyo steps with the deliberate care of a man for whom every physical movement requires its own planning. Not because he was slow, but because the mass he was managing demanded forethought. Each step was placed with precision. The clay received him. He stopped at the center of the ring. His voice, when it came, was deep and unhurried. He spoke in Japanese. An interpreter near the front of the audience translated, audible to those nearby, and then passed through whispers to those further back. "I'm told you study the empty hand," Bruce Lee said, among other things. The interpreter relayed this. Takanohana absorbed it. He looked down, the full, vertical distance of looking down from 6 feet 1 inches to 5 feet 7, with the expression of a man performing an arithmetic he already knows the answer to. "Sumo does not allow strikes," he said. "This is a grappling art. You understand that my tradition requires me to advance." A pause, and that my mass, once moving, has not been stopped in 11 years. "I understand your tradition," Bruce Lee said. "Then you understand the difficulty of what you are proposing," Takanohana said. The statement was not unkind. It had the quality of a man who would rather dissuade something unfortunate than witness it. From the audience, a journalist, German, from a sports publication that had sent him to Tokyo specifically for this event, leaned toward his interpreter and said something quietly. The interpreter nodded and made a note. Near the official section, one of the governing body members spoke to the man beside him behind his hand. The man beside him shook his head slightly. The room was processing the same problem from 2,000 angles. The problem was the same problem, it was always the same problem, and it had the same shape it always had. On one side, mass, tradition, an 11-year record of immovability. On the other side, 135 pounds and a calm face. The problem's resolution seemed obvious. The crowd believed it was obvious. Bruce Lee looked at Takanohana. "Then let us begin," he said, "and find out which understanding is more useful." The Yokozuna looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and climbed back to the dohyo, and the ceremony of beginning was completed in the careful, deliberate, time-honored manner that sumo demanded. The crowd had expected Bruce Lee to reduce the encounter to something manageable, to reframe it, to negotiate, to find the exit from the problem that the problem had left open. Instead, he had walked directly into the problem and asked it to show him what it had. The room did not know what to do with this. It watched. The ceremony of sumo is not ornamentation. The salt throwing, the handfuls of coarse salt scattered across the clay of the dohyo, served multiple purposes in its tradition. Purification, focus, the ritual extension of time before the irreversible. The Yokozuna performed it with the thoroughness of a man who has done this so many times that each performance contains every previous performance inside it. The salt left his hand in a wide arc. It caught the overhead light briefly. It struck the clay and dispersed. 2,000 people watched this. They watched it in the particular silence of a crowd that has found its attention and is not surrendering it. Bruce Lee stood at the west edge of the dohyo. He had removed his jacket some time in the last minutes. When he had done it, most of the audience hadn't caught the moment. They had been watching the Yokozuna's ceremony. The jacket was folded behind the boundary rope. His arms were bare below the short sleeves of his shirt. The audience nearest the dohyo could see them. The nearest practitioners could read them. Those who could read them were not recalculating toward concern. They were beyond recalculation at this point, past the easy arithmetic of mass differential. They were watching something more specific. The quality of the forearms. The density of what was present there. The particular way the tendons ran, the way the muscle groups had developed in the specific pattern that years of a very specific kind of training produces and no other kind of training produces. A man in the second row of the official section, elderly, a former judo competitor of some renown, a man whose knowledge of bodies and what they could do was extensive and hard-earned, had been watching Bruce Lee's arms for 2 minutes. He said nothing. His face was the face of a man revising. The sound of bare feet on clay. Takanohana's in the remaining ceremony. Each step deliberate, each placement a statement. The clay received them and compressed and held the impressions. The weight communicated through the floor of the dohyo down into the wooden platform beneath, down into the Kokugikan's foundations. The dohyo trembled slightly. Bruce Lee's feet on clay different. Minimal. The impression barely registering. The mass so much smaller that the clay gave only what the obligation of physics required and held nothing back. The contrast between the two sets of footfalls was one of the things witnesses would later try to describe and find that the description could not carry the weight of the reality. They faced each other. At their closest point, both inside the starting markers, crouched at the beginning position that sumo demanded. The disproportion was its most dramatic. The Yokozuna's mass at this proximity was not a number anymore. Numbers were for distance. This close, 580 pounds was a landscape. It was weather. It was the specific physical phenomenon of being near something that occupies more space than a person expects to be occupied. Bruce Lee crouched in the starting position with his hands on the clay. His breathing was audible to those nearest the dohyo. 3 people were close enough. They heard it later the same way, slow, even the respiration of a man who was physiologically calm in a position that should not have permitted physiological calm. One of them would say later that hearing that breathing was the first moment she understood that something unusual was happening. Not the fight. Before the fight, the breathing. Takanohana's face was composed. His eyes were on Bruce Lee's center of mass. The eyes of a man who fights by reading weight. Where it is going, how it can be redirected and overwhelmed. He found very little center of mass to read. The thought crossed his mind, briefly, The kind of thought that arrives uninvited and is dismissed because a man of his experience and tradition is not given a doubt in these moments, that he was not sure what he was looking at. He dismissed it. He had dismissed every opponent. The head referee raised his hand. He held it. 2,000 people held their breath in exact correspondence. The hand fell. Takanohana launched. 580 pounds, accelerating. There is nothing in most human experience that prepares a person for the phenomenon of a sumo yokozuna's initial charge. The weight and the speed are incompatible in the viewer's model. The mind keeps expecting the mass to resist the acceleration, keeps expecting the laws of the body to slow the thing down before it arrives. They do not. The initial charge is the product of years of conditioning specifically designed to make that mass move at that speed in the first moments of a contest, because the first moments are everything in sumo. The match is usually decided in the first collision. This collision did not occur. Bruce Lee moved. Not sideways, not back. He went under. The crouch deepened in a single, explosive motion, the legs driving him lower, the body compressing vertically, and the Yokozuna's forward momentum carrying the mass over him, through the space where the target had been. 580 pounds passed above and beside. The air displacement was physical. The crowd felt it in the front rows, the wave of displaced atmosphere that a moving mass of that scale generates. The crowd made it sound. Involuntary. Collective. Takanohana's momentum carried him 3 steps past his starting position. He recovered with the extraordinary proprioception of a man who had trained his body to manage exactly this kind of overextension. He turned. Bruce Lee was upright, standing. He had come up from the compression the same way he had gone down. One explosive coordinated motion, the legs driving the rise, the body arriving vertical before the eye could sequence the transition. The crowd had not finished processing the first movement. The Yokozuna looked at him. His expression had changed. Not drastically. This was a man of great composure. But something in the eyes. The eyes of a man who has just experienced something that his 11-year model did not contain. He charged again. Immediately. The patience of sumo was not in the first exchanges. The patience was in the strategy. The first exchanges were about establishing the grip, the control, the positioning from which everything else flowed. He charged to close the distance, to get his arms into contact, to do what 580 pounds does when it has its hands on something smaller. Bruce Lee moved laterally. A full step right, the direction change occurring faster than the charge could correct. Takanohana's outstretched arms swept through empty air. He turned again, faster this time, the experience registering, the body updating its anticipation. He advanced again, slower, arms wider, the angle of his approach designed to eliminate the lateral step that had worked twice. Bruce Lee stepped forward, inside the arms. The move was reckless to the observer's eye and precise to the practitioner's understanding. Inside the arms meant inside the grip, meant at a range where the long arms could not gather, could not secure, could not exert the leverage that made those arms so definitive. At this range, the mass was a different problem than at the range the Yokozuna preferred. At this range, mass required contact to transfer. Contact required grip. Grip required finding a target. His right hand struck. The strike was to the inside of the Yokozuna's right knee. Not a kick. The position was too close for a kick. A targeted compression strike. The heel of the palm against the specific nerve cluster of the inner knee, the location that when addressed correctly produces an involuntary message through the leg. Unload this side. The Yokozuna's right knee buckled. Not collapsed, buckled. A fraction of an inch. The weight redistributed left in the involuntary response. Bruce Lee's left hand was already at the Yokozuna's left hip. Not gripping, directing. The placement of a hand that understood where the weight had just moved and was there to greet it. The pressure was lateral, not pushing the mass, not attempting to move 580 pounds with one hand, but nudging the specific, momentary distribution of that mass in the direction it had already chosen to go. Sumo falls are not managed like other falls. When a Yokozuna goes down, the physics of it are the physics of a building coming down. The sound is significant. The vibration travels through the floor, through the platform, through the walls. The clay of the dohyo records it. The Yokozuna went down on his left side. The sound reached every corner of the Kokugikan. 2,000 people experienced the impact as a physical event. The vibration through their seats, through their feet, the bone-deep thud of 580 pounds meeting the clay of a platform it had not expected to meet. The silence that followed was total. Not the hell-breath silence of anticipation. The silence of a room in which every operating assumption has just been revised simultaneously. Takanohana was on the clay. He lay there for a moment. His eyes were open. He was looking at the canopy above the dohyo, the hanging structure with its 4 seasonal colors, which he had looked at 10,000 times in his career from a standing position. He was looking at it from below. He processed this. Bruce Lee stood at the edge of the circle, breathing, even, controlled. The body that had done what it had done, showing no physiological record of having done it. The 2,000 people were frozen in their seats. In 15 centuries of sumo, the dohyo had absorbed 10,000 contests. It held the memory of all of them in its clay, the compressed records of every champion who had trained his body to become an instrument of mass and leverage and tradition. The names went back generations. The weight of the tradition was not metaphorical. It was architectural. It was in the wood, the clay, the rope boundary. It was in the air of the Kokugikan, which had witnessed so much of one specific thing that it had begun to smell like that thing. Tonight, something different had been added to the record. The Yokozuna came up from the clay the way tides come in, slowly, inevitably, with the patient gathering of force that has no urgency, because there is no urgency available to it. He rolled to one side. His hands found purchase. He pushed himself to his knees. He came upright. It took time. The audience did not move while it was happening. They were not ready to move yet. He stood. He was on both feet on the clay of his dohyo, his arena, the context in which he was absolute. And he stood and looked at the man across from him and was quiet in the way of a man who has been taken somewhere he has never been and is finding his bearings. His face communicated nothing visible to the back rows. But those nearest the dohyo, the officials, the practitioners in the first tier, could see what his face was doing. It was conducting its own private negotiation between what had just occurred and what his 30 years of preparation had told him could occur. The negotiation was visible in the quality of his stillness. He had not fallen in 11 years. The record existed because it was accurate, because in 11 years of competition, in the context of his discipline, his body had proved itself sufficient to the challenges it had encountered. Not because he was fortunate or protected or matched poorly, because he was what he was. He looked across the dohyo. Bruce Lee was at the western boundary. He had walked there during the Yokozuna's rising, unhurried, his footfall on the clay as quiet as before. He was standing just inside the rope boundary, his hands at his sides. He was not watching the Yokozuna recover with the assessment of a fighter evaluating damage. He was watching with the simple attention of a man waiting for the moment to declare itself complete. The officials in the front row were very still. The eldest among them, the man who had spent 50 years in this building, who had seen more than any other person present, was looking at the dohyo with an expression that could not be read from the outside, but that those who knew him would have recognized. The expression he wore when something had occurred that he was going to need to think about for a long time. In the upper tiers, the sound had begun its return, the ambient sound of 2,000 people breathing and existing. But it was subdued. The normal volume of the room had not yet reasserted itself. The room was still partially inside the event. One person whispered to the person beside them. The words were Japanese and were not translated, but the tone carried. It was the tone of a question to which the person beside them had no answer. Bruce Lee descended the dohyo steps. He walked to where his jacket was folded. He picked it up and put it on. His movement was the same as it had been in every room before this one. The same care, the same unhurried attention to the small task. The collar straightened, the front smoothed. He turned toward the hall's exit corridor. He stopped. He did not turn back. He addressed the Kokugikan and everyone in it through the medium of his own stillness, through the carrying quality of a voice that did not require volume to reach the back of a large room. Mass does not decide the contest, he said. The contest decides itself. Mass is only one of the factors. He walked. The sound of his footsteps on the stone floor of the corridor receded and then disappeared. In the Kokugikan, 2,000 people sat in the particular silence of people who have been present at something that will outlast them. The Yokozuna stood on his dohyo and did not move for a long time. The story entered Japan's martial world in the way of things that challenge established categories, with resistance first, and then, as the witnesses came forward, with a growing and eventually irresistible acknowledgement. The official's first response was restraint. The governing body had concerns that were institutional rather than personal. The reputation of the tradition, the implications of a public event that had produced an outcome so far outside the tradition's normal parameters. They were careful with their language. They described the evening as an exhibition, a demonstration, a meeting of disciplines. Language that distributed the weight of what had occurred across a wider surface, so that no single point bore too much. But the witnesses were 2,000. You cannot contain 2,000 witnesses. They came from different countries, different disciplines, different relationships to the evening's events. They carried the account in their different languages back to their different communities, and the account accumulated translations without losing its core. The core was impervious to translation. The core was arithmetic. 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds. 580 pounds on the clay of the dohyo, and the direction of the fall. The Yokozuna did not speak publicly about the exhibition for several months. When he did, he spoke in a measured, formal language of his tradition, a language that did not have many words for being surprised because his tradition had not required them often. He said that he had encountered a method he did not understand. He said that the method did not operate through mass or leverage in the manner he was trained to address. He said that what had moved him was not the force of the smaller man's body. He was clear about this, because it was true, but something in the application of timing and direction that had found the single moment when 580 pounds was not entirely its own. He said he had spent the months since the exhibition thinking about that moment. He said he had not finished thinking about it. This was perhaps the most significant account that emerged from the evening, not because of what it said about Bruce Lee, but because of what it said about the Yokozuna, a man of great pride, of enormous competitive achievement, of a tradition that did not encourage the acknowledgement of reversal, and he was not able to dismiss the event. He was not able to file it under the category of aberration, lucky circumstance, the specific exception that confirms the general rule. It had been too clean for that. The martial arts practitioners who had been present and who moved in the networks where such accounts traveled fastest spoke about the biomechanics of it with the focused specificity of their profession. The knee strike and the hip nudge, the way the movement had been built not on opposition to the mass, but on the brief, specific moment when the mass had overcommit and was therefore the mechanism of its own undoing. Not strength against strength. Not speed against slowness. The specific identification of the instant when 580 pounds of moving mass became an argument it was making against itself. This was the thing that the practitioners recognized and the casual audience could not easily name. That what had happened on the dohyo was not a miracle. It was not magic. It was a demonstration of a principle that had been the tradition for a long time. The principle that mass in motion has direction, and direction has a geometry, And geometry has vulnerabilities that mass cannot protect against, because mass cannot change its direction as fast as a smaller, more precise force can find those vulnerabilities. Bruce Lee had not beaten 580 pounds. He had redirected it. The distinction mattered to the people who understood it. To everyone else, the story was simpler. A man of 135 pounds had stood on the Dohyo with a 580-pound Yokozuna, and the Yokozuna had found the clay. The simplicity was accurate. Simplicity often is. In the years that followed, when the name came up in those circles, in the dojos, in the training halls, in the quiet conversations between practitioners who had spent their lives trying to understand what the body was capable of, the Tokyo exhibition occupied a particular place in the conversation. Not the most dramatic account, not the largest audience, but the most extreme disproportion, the widest gap between the numbers and the outcome. 445 pounds. That was the difference between them standing on the Dohyo. What closed the gap was not muscle or speed or technique in isolation. What closed the gap was the complete integration of all of it. The years of understanding compressed into the seconds of application, deployed without ego, without urgency, without anything extra. The most dangerous thing on that clay was invisible until it moved. And when it moved, it was already finished. And when it was finished, it put on its jacket and walked through the corridor and said one sentence and was gone, leaving the Dohyo, leaving the clay with its new memory, leaving 2,000 people who would carry what they had witnessed for the rest of their lives. Because some things do not need to be loud to be permanent. Because some things become permanent precisely because they were quiet. The Dohyo remembered. The clay remembered. And the record, which had stood for 11 years and was built to stand forever, had been addressed by 135 pounds of absolute intention, and had yielded.